We're going to go ahead and get started with our third in a series of this year for the webinar on work history, experience, and degree documentation. My name is Rick Cox. I'm a CEM commissioner, part of the International Association of Emergency Managers. Would like to welcome everyone who is participating today. We hope that you find this a meaningful and learning experience. I hope we'll be able to address a lot of your concerns and issues and provide you with information that will help you succeed in your quest to earn your certification. With that, would like to thank everybody for joining. And as we go through, we will have a series of slides to look at. And once the slides we've gone through the presentation, we'll open this up for questions at the end. And we do ask that you do hold the questions to the end because, quite honestly, we'll probably cover a lot of these. Now, as we do this process, if you have a specific question to your particular circumstances, you can always drop an email to the info@iaem.com, which you'll see on all the slides. And one of the staff members there will be able to address your question and go from there. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that we will look at is our certification, work history, and experience. Now, I'm not going to try to read the slides to you, but I will take a moment and explain that in all of what we do as certification commissioners is to review the documentation the candidate has submitted. Now, it's pretty obvious for some people that they are a practicing certified or a practicing emergency manager, and they are just having to fill in documentation requirements, but their documentation is very simple. We do have others, though, who have to go into depth to explain what they're doing. A lot of times we get into the review of an application when a candidate doesn't work as a full-time emergency manager, and they ask, well, how do I demonstrate 3 years of full-time or equivalency? Reviewing an application many years ago was a Red Cross worker. They documented over 4,000 hours of experience that once it came out at the very end, they had more than documented 3 years of experience. I said 4,000 is more like 7,000 hours of comprehensive emergency management work. And that is what we're looking for. You know, what have you done that is comprehensive emergency management? When we look at participating in full-scale exercises or looking at an actual event, let me address the actual event first. The actual event doesn't have to be a presidentially declared disaster in the United States. You could have a local disaster, a statewide disaster, provincial-wide, or something that deals in your realm, your world, your community, that would very taxing to the jurisdiction, to the community, and explain exactly what was involved. But the key here is it's comprehensive emergency management, and we'll get into the detail on that in just a few minutes. When we talk about participation in a full-scale exercise, as opposed to the two separate functional exercises, we're looking at something that is truly looking at a significant role. Being a logistics person at a full-scale airport exercise may have been someone who provided a vital need for that exercise is a rehab for the people working on that July day. And that may have been an important function, but that is not a comprehensive major participation role that we're looking at. So when we start looking at the whole realm, it's important for everyone to try to read the directions and follow the directions when they work on their package. So with that in mind, we'll move forward here in just a minute. But someone asked me, says, what do we use for our documentation? An example in the exercises would be the exercise packets that come together, the exercise plan, the after action reports, and so forth. A little tip that I discussed with a fellow commissioner, we take and look at a document, and if I see somebody's name and they're claiming a full-scale exercise, and I'm looking at a 40, 50, 60 page document, instead of spending all the time sitting there reading word for word for word, sometimes I do a Control F, and I want to see just how many times their name comes up in the document and what is their name doing in the document. That helps me understand, just what was their involvement in this document, whether that was an exercise or whether it was an actual event. When we look at our documentation, obviously, we are looking at things that are statements that are signed by supervisors as good example of documentation. And again, this goes through regardless of which part of the packet you're working on. A signed statement from your supervisor or another individual will work very well. All right, so let's take and look at the details on the work history. This comes directly from the application, and it's important to understand that an individual must submit documentation that has equivalency of 3 years full-time. We calculate a year at 1,920 hours, which you see on the screen. And again, comprehensive disaster and emergency management. When we look at that 3 years, we know that can be supplemented to 2 years, changed to 2 years if you do have a baccalaureate or higher degree in emergency management. That being said, some people have that degree experience and others do not. But to get your CEM, you're looking at either the 2 years or the 3 years. In a recent review, a commissioner was having to look over the documentation and read the person's position. In looking at what they had submitted, it wasn't a clear-cut identifier that what their job was emergency management. They had a role in environmental health and safety at their workplace. This is in the private sector. That can be justified if they provide the explanation. A lot of times when I'm reviewing a packet and I read something and I'm thinking, is this what we're looking for? Sometimes I'll go back to the CEM corner and pull up one of the articles there that addresses your experience and your background and try to look and say, does this really cover what is intended to be a comprehensive emergency manager's position? If we find that, that's great. But sometimes it's very difficult if it's not black and white saying that John, the position is an emergency manager and identifies the 4 phases. When we look at the experience as far as as far as the exercise, you can look at the matrix that's included in the packet, and as you look at that, it will identify the full scale versus the 2 functional exercises. We look at the FEMA guidance for what a functional exercise includes. And we're talking about documentation for 2 separate ones. A letter from your supervisor provides good information and verification of your participation. There are occasions where we've had experiences when somebody who is submitting their documentation submits tabletop exercises. And unfortunately, as you read through the documentation they submit, it may have been a very detailed tabletop exercise, but it was just in fact that, a tabletop exercise. When we look back at the reach back on your experience, the exercises must have occurred within the last 10 years, as well as the actual experience from a declared disaster or major public event. If you'll look at the instructions on the slide, the major public event could include a sporting event, a state visit, or a special event. Something that puts a large amount of strain on the resources and requires standing up an emergency operations center. As we move on to our 4th slide, the application package is very handy in adding materials to it. It's important to, when you click on certain parts and you identify the period cover, to make sure that as a reviewer, I'm going to understand what I'm looking at. As I review a packet, I need to make sure that, was this job a full-time position? Was it part-time? Was it volunteer? Just exactly what was the work and what did it entail? It does ask for a position description. This is where you identify that you have included one. And when you look at the position description, we try to get a good clarification as to, as one advances through the job market, they may start in at a lower level, lower tier, and then work their way through until they get to a position where they now think they've got their 3 years and they're interested in applying for their CEM. Individuals who have applied for their CEM have come up short on the work history, and we have awarded AEMs because they were not able to document and justify the 3-year equivalency to full-time. And again, a supervisor statement is something that will verify that the position description provided verifies that this is candidate Jim Smith's position description, which and again provides that information that we're looking for. Now let's move over and talk about the experience as it relates to your exercise participation. Looking at the detail, you know, the role of the full-scale exercise will work if we can see where the individual candidate has participated in a significant role, such as the planner for the exercise, and then may facilitate over to a controlling position for the exercise or an evaluating position in the exercise. But again, it's more than just saying, I worked logistics, and we find your name listed on a document as a logistics person. A letter from, as we've said, supervisor, the different types of documents that we use to document our exercises will suffice. If you are unable to find something that will support that, you know, the letter from the exercise team leader or other personnel that can provide verification of your participation and your role in the exercise. Verifying that you were at the exercise is one thing, but exactly what role did you participate and how you lent to the role itself. I see that we have approximately 68 people that are participating in today's webinar. Again, I hope that you find this information useful. There will be a recording of this available on the website after today's presentation. And if you have questions, we'll be taking questions at the end. Additionally, if you have specific questions about your specific circumstances, we will provide a contact on the last slide where you can send an email and direct that information. Now, we'll take a look at where we can document our experience on the application itself. Providing the dates of the exercise is important so that we know when the exercises were or what the dates were, as well as providing a description. This is your opportunity to provide the commissioner who's going to review your application information about what your involvement was. You can take and be very specific here. Granted, there are limitations to what you can add as far as volumes. In other words, you can't put the whole exercise booklet here, but you can be specific and include the objectives and the purpose of your exercise. You can be specific when you describe your role as to exactly what your participation was in the world of comprehensive emergency management as it relates to this exercise. And I keep bringing up the word comprehensive emergency management. Over the years, we've come across that fire chief retired, that military person retired who says, well, I manage emergencies all the time. And it's not a play on words, so we have to identify comprehensive and the 4 phases of emergency management. The CEM corner goes into great detail when it talks about exactly how do you identify what you do as far as being an emergency manager. I've talked to people in the civilian world, the non-traditional role, the contractor role, and as they express an interest in becoming a certified emergency manager, you sometimes wonder, are they truly doing emergency management or are they just a planner or a plan reviewer? I've always encouraged individuals to get out the principles of emergency management, to review that, and then make a determination, is that truly what type of work that they do? Moving on. Once you've completed this, you can see in the lower left side where you can add files and you can add the documentation necessary to support your application. When we talk about actual experience and your role when it comes to an actual disaster or an actual emergency, a local flooding event may not have been enough to meet a local threshold for a governmental disaster declaration, but if it involved staffing an emergency operations center for more than an operational period, then that may very well justify your actual experience in a disaster, emergency, or a major public event. If you participate in carrying out a major role for a sporting event as a major public event, there are a lot of air shows out in the communities, and if your role participated in supporting a major air show, that could be a major public event that you may use as an actual experience. And again, just as the instructions call for being specific when it comes to what roles you played and your significant participation. Again, being specific about what you do. Let's move on, and we'll come in for questions here in a moment. Let's talk about our certification and education aspect. When we look at the educational side, I can't stress the importance of having a accredited institution that has awarded your baccalaureate degree. Over the years, the CEM Commission has seen a lot of different things, and we have seen baccalaureate degrees that have come out of diploma bills that are not regionally accredited institutions. If it's not an easily recognizable institution, many commissioners will take and look up on the institution's website and verify that that is a regionally accredited institution. There have been times when institutions were not recognized, and the application was sent back for either further explanation or an actual denial because of not being regionally accredited. Now, in the Asia, International, Latin America, or Caribbean councils, you can't substitute the 2 years full time per year for each year of college. So typically, a baccalaureate degree, if it requires 4 years, you'd be required to have your 8 years of full-time equivalency experience, in addition to your 3 years, for a total of 11 years before you could get your CEM. Now, as of this past January, you'll note that Canada has come on, and they're requiring that candidates must submit, their bachelor's degree or postgraduate degree in the field of emergency management as well. As we look at, our documentation for education, it's important that when the candidate submits this in the application, that if you have gotten married since you received your baccalaureate degree, and now you are using a married name, we need to have something that verifies, because a commissioner looks at the document and they see the last name of Smith, but then when they look at the baccalaureate degree or the transcript for that on the that candidate, and it's Jones, they don't match up. So even though marriage does happen and there are name changes, we need to understand what's going on and not make an assumption. If you decide to if you get a degree in emergency management related, disaster or emergency management related field, you can use that towards your training, and that's a discussion in another webinar. But should you happen to use part of a degree to receive your training, then that to count towards training hours, then the baccalaureate degree cannot be used towards meeting the degree requirement. There is some confusion there. Hopefully we can explain that in depth if there's any questions. It does note here that the degree has been required since January 1, 2010. I point out to people that when the CEM program first came out, it required a degree, but then there was a waiver for a period of time that said if you had experience, you can go in under the waiver. And finally, the board of directors said we require the degree from this point forward. And again, in all the councils, there is a degree requirement for the US, Canada, Europa, and Oceania. But over in the Asia, International, Latin American, and Caribbean, which are just now coming in, the Caribbean and Latin America just coming in, they're not required to have that 4-year, the baccalaureate degree at this time. And this varies from council to council. If one submits a transcript, then that transcript must indicate that a degree has been confirmed. There have been opportunities to read a transcript where it does not clearly identify that the degree has been conferred, and depending upon the type of transcript that has been submitted. And as we look at the application aspect of this, where we document our education, you can list at this location the various degrees that you may have, and it is possible to list more than one degree. There's nothing wrong with overlisting, over documenting. The requirement is that you have to have a baccalaureate degree, then you list that. If you have a degree in emergency or disaster management, you list that here as well if that's in addition to your degree. Obviously, the name of the institution is important. Again, commissioners in verifying information will take, and if it's not an obvious name of an institution that they're familiar with, we'll look up that institution to verify that it is a regionally accredited college. The date the degree was inferred, as well as the type of degree, and then you can attach your documentation accordingly. Let's talk a little bit about using of a degree in emergency management. The chart has been posted that shows that if you have the degree in emergency or disaster management, and how many years since that degree has been inferred, as to how much training hours you have to have. It's very simple to identify, as long as we fully understand that the degree you're submitting is in disaster or emergency management related. It helps if it says that, but there are degrees that are issued in public administration, and then once you look at the transcript, the transcript may state with an emphasis or a study in disaster or emergency management and so forth. Again, having a transcript that is readable is important as it's been scanned in. Depending upon the years that have passed since you received your degree will determine exactly how many training hours in emergency management you have to have. And there have been applications here recently where people have had 0 training in emergency management because within the last 36 months, they have received a degree in disaster or emergency management. This works for a master's degree as well. If someone has their baccalaureate degree in an unrelated field, but then they receive their master's degree in disaster or emergency management, this is the place where it's indicated along with the transcript, and we can take and review that from here. Now, I did say master's degree, and I will put a word of caution here. If you have a master's degree in emergency management and you are using that to fulfill your EM degree so that you can avoid having to document emergency management training, you still need to document that you've had your general management training. All right, I'm going to move to our 11th slide. And we'll talk about some common application pitfalls. I sometimes equate this to auditing paperwork. We all know what it's like to deal with an auditor or have heard horror stories about dealing with auditors. The CEM Commission is not that way. However, I would like to suggest if an individual is submitting their packet, they need to approach it from the standpoint that I want to make sure that I have the information provided as clear and as understood as it can be. If someone has to decipher information, then sometimes that's not easy to understand. For example, when a military person is using a military form to identify their participation in either an actual experience or in a full-scale exercise, there's nothing wrong with taking that document and highlighting in a yellow, for example, and identify that exercise or the part of that form that deals with the exercise, the dates, and the role, and then scan that in so that as a commissioner, when I look at that document, I am drawn to that part which is highlighted and say, oh, okay, here's where this individual has participated in a full-scale exercise or an actual event. Sometimes when people start uploading their documentation, they were, I won't say lazy, but they were sloppy in the naming of the documents as they scanned them into their computer. If you scan in a document that's going to support your work experience, then I would suggest that you give it a name that says work, so that when you upload it, you know that you have the right document to go with that part. If it's your supervisor's letter that supports your job description, then the same. Identify that it's a letter from your supervisor, and then indicate that it was your job description. This helps you, the candidate, as you put together your packet, in that when the commissioner clicks on the documentation for the supervisor's letter, it actually comes up as a supervisor's letter and not something that was accidentally misnamed. And it's always important to review what you have submitted to make sure everything is neat and in order. If the documentation instructions say we need a signature, or it needs to be on letterhead, then please do so. There are reasons for this. In this day and age, anybody with a computer and a laser printer can develop any kind of document that they want, and could be very impressive looking. Not that we accuse people of being forgery, but we do like to make sure that it's incumbent that we are seeing information that is valid. And that's where we come into making sure the claims are verified. Over the years, commissioners have learned to validate information. We use a premise of let's trust, but let's validate as we go through the process. It's incumbent upon the candidate to submit that appropriate documentation. In this particular webinar, though, as we talk about the work experience, again, the common pitfall of comprehensive emergency management experience seems to be one that will take and get most people in this area. Failing to, again, truly identify that what I do is emergency management. It deals with planning. It deals with response. It deals with recovery. It deals with mitigation. If an individual never addresses mitigation in their job, then are they doing comprehensive emergency management? No, not really. Everyone thinks that response is fun and sexy. In a true full-time emergency management position, unless you work as a federal coordinating officer who is constantly out in the field doing response and recovery, most of the time recovery is limited to a very small percentage, or excuse me, response is limited to a very small response percentage of your work time. The majority of your time is spent in preparation and recovery, as well as mitigation. Okay, so as we work our way into getting ready for questions, we'd like to make sure that if you ever have questions in regards to your specifics, if you need a mentor, we have a featured mentor program. Those are people who have been through the program. They've recertified at least one time, whether they recertified as an AEM or a CEM. They've been through the process, and they can provide local support for you as you work towards your certification. I will take this moment, and someone asked me once about the difference between an AEM and a CEM, and I very vividly point out that in 5 years, when an AEM goes to recertify their first time out, they have to do the same thing that I have to do as a CEM when I go to recertify. We have to have training, and we have to have contributions to the profession. So at that time, we have the same type of things that we do. Okay, we're going to take and open this up to questions. So if you have any questions, let me know what they are, and we'll see if we can address those as we go through this. First question comes up out of the military. It says, can you use time in the military as emergency management specialist count towards this? And yes, you can. And unfortunately, the person points out that, this may be some of this information may be classified. I can express to you that we've looked at information, and I realize there's a lot of classified things out there. Not that we want to divulge secrets or anything, but that documentation can be made available from a supervisor that can support what your role was in an emergency management experience. We've had individuals from all walks of the military, and that's been something we've been able to document, or we've been able to review and support. Another question. Some letters from previous supervisors will be impossible to acquire since these persons are retired, moved away, or are deceased. And what's the workaround for something like that? Unfortunately, if it's documentation that we have to reach back more than 10 years, obviously that can be a problem. On the other side of this, it lays to, from this point forward, one should always make sure that we do keep good documentation, good support, good files in our records as we move forward. There was a question once about an individual who served as a consultant and how he could get information to support his position description. We said, we've used the analogy that if you are a private self-employed type person and you want to get your certification, a letter from a client that would verify your role in planning, response, recovery, etc., would help justify that, yes, you do comprehensive emergency management. Question: volunteer emergency management positions are a rarity full-time in my jurisdiction. Can the 3-year requirement be met with the same hours over a longer period of time? Absolutely. Absolutely. Anyone who has submitted or can document, the 3 years of time over a longer period of time works out just well. So yes, you can do that. And we encourage that. One of my first applications that I reviewed, looking for the full 3 years dealing with a volunteer, was with a Red Cross worker who submitted a sheaf of papers that documented over, I think it was over 7,000 hours of experience. Another question: can you clarify the information about a bachelor degree from Canada? Can you clarify related field? And can the 3 or 4 year bachelor be in any field or study, or does it specifically need to be the field of emergency management? The requirement is that you have a bachelor's degree. That's pretty simple, from an accredited institution. In the United States, for example, bachelor degrees are based upon a 4-year type program with a certain number of hours. When you look at other countries, some countries have bachelor degrees that are based upon a 3-year program. When we talk about receiving a bachelor's degree, it can be in any topic as long as you're demonstrating that you have and document that you have a bachelor's degree. Now, when we start looking at a bachelor's degree in emergency management or disaster related field, then that's usually pretty specific to the point that we look at a transcript. And as we read through the transcript, the commissioners can identify that, yes, this degree in public administration has an emphasis in emergency management because it has the related emergency management related courses. I hope I covered that. All right, and let's go to our next question here. And by the way, I want to thank the staff for reviewing the questions and providing those for me to review. Okay, you provided examples of exercise planners, not players. Will this requirement be met if I participated as a operations section chief in a full-scale exercise as a player? If it comes right down to what are you documenting? The short answer is yes, if you're providing the right type and adequate documentation as an operations section chief in a full-scale exercise. Showing your name on a chart, an org chart, doesn't necessarily qualify as the fact that you had a significant role. If your significant role details out and documents briefings that you provided, incident action plans that you developed, and so forth, then you're looking at more of the type of documentation. But just an org chart does not cut it. It needs to be an explanation of what an individual did and what their roles were in that event. There have been operations section chiefs identified for small fuel spills, as opposed to an operations section chief for hurricane recovery. They're obviously the same in title, but obviously different in role and work of scope. Okay, moving on to our next question. Is there a required format for submitting documentation of work history? Is this a Microsoft Word letter from the supervisor, a form provided by IAM, or something else? No, there's not a specific format. Obviously, if it is your legitimate position description, that works out great. If you have a organization that you work for that has a professional HR department with job descriptions and so forth, that will suffice. But a letter, a documentation from a supervisor that says, Billy Bob is my candidate, is my employee, and this is Billy Bob's position description, then that documents his role. Documents his position description. Okay, let's move on to another question. How much exercise documentation do you require? I was only allowed to add one document, not multiple. That is, plan and measles, after action reports, and so forth. If you scan it in as one document, I have seen documents come in that are many pages long. You don't have to scan in everything that you have, but enough that clearly identifies that you've had a legitimate role in an exercise program, whether you're the player or the planner, the developer, and what your roles were. We don't need 20 pages of message injects that have nothing to do with you. Sometimes a page of participation that lists participants, sign-in rosters, check-in, check-out sheets, along with a description of your role will sometimes satisfy. Yes, you can only put in one actual document, but when you scan in the documents, you can make sure you have the appropriate pages. We have seen exercise plans over the years that are 40, 50, 80 pages long, and only 5 or 10 is all that's needed to suffice. Again, use some good judgment here and submit what you're working. Go to another question. I'm currently a volunteer for the American Red Cross, and I recently responded to a house fire as a DAT member with discounts towards my training. This would not count as training because you're looking at response is not training, as training is not response. Training is looked at and classified as classroom type training events where there's defined lesson plans, objectives, and so forth. In a response, that's not considered training. Moving on to another question. Regarding exercises, does a player role count towards the exercise credit? Well, we've addressed that, and it will if you can document. And again, it's got to document what role that you've participated in the exercise. Again, as I used an example earlier, if you were the logistics section chief, then we need to see what you did as a logistics section chief, making sure that there was plenty of liquid refreshment on the tarmac for the full-scale exercise on a July day. As admirable as that was, I don't know that that's a significant role for an emergency manager to participate in. So, you know, you have to identify your significant role. All right, we'll get into a couple more questions here. Let me look these over. Math question. I love math. I count 2,080 hours based on 52 weeks. Are we discounting vacation? Uh, for the purposes of your CEM, we count 1,920 hours in the year that we look at. Are we discounting vacation? If we get into a point where we start finite counting of hours, we're going too deep. You know, is this person working full time? If the person serves as the county 911 coordinator, the county GIS coordinator, the county floodplain manager, and the county emergency manager, that's 4 different roles. What percentage of his work time does he do as an emergency manager? You can say, well, the 911 coordinator is an emergency management type role, as is the GIS coordinator, because we use GIS in emergency management, as is the role as floodplain manager. Again, we go back to the principles of emergency management, and you can find that on the IAEM website. You can go to FEMA.gov and find the principles of emergency management and get a true identifier. Is this what I'm doing? And am I spending 100% of my time in this? Or if I'm spending 75% of my time, then prorate that accordingly. Let me check the time here. We have about 5 more minutes, so we'll try to get in another question or two. It says, I keep hearing the phrase, there's no double dipping. Understand that to mean that you can't count the same experience. For example, an exercise. Is it okay to use the same document twice to show separate things? By all means. You can use the same document to count and to demonstrate various experiences. The most common is a memorandum that comes from a supervisor that bullets out the fact that Rick is an emergency manager. He works full time, and he does, all the planning, response, recovery, and mitigation for our community. The second bullet may state that Rick conducted a big exercise. Third bullet may count that Rick did responded to a flooding disaster. The third may talk about Rick's involvement in providing speaking to the various county employees on disaster preparedness, to cover contributions and so forth. Yes, one document can cover a multitude of things as long as they're separate. Now, to claim that the one event is used multiple times, yes, that would be considered double dipping, and we truly avoid that when we can. Verification from supervisors, regardless of whether they are currently working or they just retired, it doesn't matter, it can count. And let's see, let me look at my time and we'll take this last question. I've been the emergency management director for a municipality for the last 8 years. During that time, we have participated in 4 federal disasters. During that time, the town has had 2 supervisors, one who has now left the position. Does the experience verification letter from the individual need to be on town letterhead? It would be good if you have that. However, if the person is retired and it is understood that that person's retired, you obviously would not have, he or she may not have verification on letterhead. Now, with that in mind, I would think that you would have other type of documentation if you worked for federal disasters, where that would take and identify your participation, and the retirees document would just add support to that. Okay. As I'm looking at my clock, I'm seeing that we have about 2 minutes or so to go. We'll call that on our questions. I would like to take and leave you this information. We've enjoyed presenting today the information on the work history, experience, and the degree documentation. I hope this has provided you with information that you need. If you have any unanswered or additional questions, you can send them to the email address. And if you'll see it on the lower right-hand side of the screen where it says ceminfo@iaem.com, and a staff member will take and either forward that question out to a CEM or provide information that you can find your answer. And again, anything that you can do to work towards your credential is important. I would like to tell everyone that I appreciate you having the time out of your day to participate. This will be available, and our Feature Mentor program is available on the website. Please check it out, and any CEM commissioner will be willing to provide you any kind of assistance as they can. The last thing to remember, though, is if you're going to get your AEM or your CEM, the first step relies on you to get up and go get it. So with that, I hope you have a great day and be safe out there.